Well, here at Anchor Bible Church, we alternate week to week on praying together as a body and taking communion. And so, of course, this week we will be taking communion. And for the next couple minutes, we're going to look at a section of Scripture with the intention of preparing our hearts to take the Lord's table. It's an interesting bit of providence that Greg briefly mentioned, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. And that's what we'll be looking at tonight. But we'll start in verse 9. Genesis 3, verse 9 through 14 for now. Yahweh God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" And he said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" And the man said, "The woman who you gave to be with me, she gave to me from the tree, and I ate." Then Yahweh God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" And the woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." And Yahweh God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you more than any of the cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life." And we'll stop there for now. Now, of course, this section of Scripture is immediately following the first act of rebellion of mankind to his Creator. And contained in these couple of verses, we have a real glimpse into the character and the nature of God, specifically towards his holy justice and his divine grace. Now, before we go further, I want you to consider something. Most of us, if not all of us, have been very familiar with a basic understanding of the Bible and the God of the Bible since we were young. And specifically amongst these things, we're very familiar with God's mercy. Now, unfortunately, the result oftentimes from this is that we are often tempted to take it for granted, and this is a shameful thing to do. His mercy is not to be taken for granted. So if we can attempt to look at this with fresh eyes, here is what we would see. The Creator, who has just finished his creation, that was very good, has put man in total dominion over his creation and has shown him nothing but kindness. With only one rule: don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it is not soon after these things that man, who comes from dust, not only rebels, but then attempts to excuse their sin instead of taking responsibility. Any rational person's first thought would be that this is not going to end well. If that is not your first thought, you might be presuming on the grace, on the riches of God's grace. Our only expectation from what we have just read should be judgment. This Creator ought to very severely punish these people, if not totally wipe them off the earth. And so from here, there are 2 points to consider. Number one, the sin of all 3 participants in this rebellion is punished. Exodus chapter 34, when Moses is on the mount with God, and he asks God to show him his glory. And God shows him a physical representation of some of his glory, and then he gives him words to tell Moses who he is from God's own mouth. And this is what he says. Yahweh passed by in front of him and called out, "Yahweh, Yahweh God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin, yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished." visiting the iniquity of fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and the fourth generations. And so we see that God punishes sin, and sometimes that sin has lasting consequences. But he does punish sin because he is just. And we see that in the curse on Satan, on Adam and Eve. Though it should be noted that God did not punish it to the full extent. We even see mercy here. The second thing is this, that God shows his divine grace here. If we go back to Genesis, we will then read verse 15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Just to quickly point out, it's pretty amazing to even see that God is not saying there will be enmity between me and you. There will be enmity between Satan and the woman. That is not God and man, but it is Satan and man and their seed. This wouldn't have been 100% clear maybe to Adam and Eve what exactly was happening. Of course, not to its fullest extent. But they surely overheard this between God and Satan and had a good idea of what was happening. And as we stand now, we look back and we see that this is a promise of a great salvation accomplished by the seed of Eve, despite a great rebellion by Adam and Eve, and not only by them, but by all of mankind. We must not allow ourselves to be calloused in seeing that no sooner than came the curse for sin comes an even greater act of grace. And as we look ahead several thousand years from this moment, we look to see at the cross, and we see this promise fulfilled. As Jesus Christ hangs on the cross and suffers beyond comprehension, the seed of Eve's heel has now been bruised. And on that same cross, as Christ drinks from the full cup of God's wrath on behalf of all who would ever be saved, we see the head of Satan being crushed. As our sin is paid for, and sin and the power of death are conquered forever. This promise of reconciliation was given in the garden, fulfilled in the cross, and remembered now as we partake in the Lord's Supper.